Alrighty, good evening, folks. This is Morgan. Tonight's episode is a really interesting one. It's the first author interview that we've ever done. Tonight we're joined by Mr. James Eggebeen. James is the author of 7 books, including the Apprentice to Master series and the recently released Indentured Magic. James has worked in many fields, including programming, tech, business, and the United States Navy. Very impressive. And since 2011 began writing fantasy fiction and hasn't stopped since. Shalini and I had a great time speaking with James, and hopefully you'll have a equally great time listening. Cheers.
All right, good evening, folks. Welcome to podcast number 10. This is a special one. It's our first author interview ever. We're here with Mr. James Eggebeen. Thank you for coming on, James.
Great, thanks for having me.
So I guess just to begin, James, just describe yourself a little bit for us and tell us about your work and a little bit as well about your new release, Indentured Magic.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Midwest on a very small farm outside of a very small town, and couldn't wait to get out of there because it gets cold in the winter. And it snows a lot, and I really don't like snow. So I called the Navy and I said, give me a good education, take me where it doesn't snow, and I'm yours for 6 years. So they trained me on communications and weapons systems, navigations, and then I came out to California, got involved in the high-tech world and did a number of startups in hardware, software, got a whole bunch of patents and really esoteric stuff that nobody cares about anymore. And as a class to finish my undergraduate, I needed an English credit. And the only thing I could get my hands on was creative writing. So I said, well, got to get a credit, got to get it done. So I took creative writing, and the teacher showed me what the structure of a story was and how they worked. And I was like, this is so cool. I can do this. So I started writing, and I wrote a lot of short stories. I sold a bunch of them early. And then a number of years ago, my wife went home to the Philippines, left me alone for 3 months. And then a married man alone for 3 months can get into a lot of trouble. So I took a short story and said, I'm going to turn this into a novel. So I spent 3 months writing my first novel. Yeah. And then I hired an editor, and she told me how horribly I had missed the mark.
Oh, no.
And we spent a year cleaning it up and published it and put it on Amazon. Then I took my wife to Europe for a month, and I came back and there was money. It's like, this is so cool.
Wow, that's the dream, isn't it?
Yeah. And that was the first one, the Apprentice to Master series, and it was, just a kind of a coming of age wizards kind of a thing. And then I wrote a couple more books in that, and I had a couple more in the series, and I'm working on another one and a couple of standalones, and then I did the Indentured Magic, which is kind of a radical departure for me, because most of the stuff I did was designed for audiences of all ages. So I have young kids in grade school who read my early stuff. Indentured Magic is pretty dark, and it's thematically dealing with a subject that is not really suitable for young kids. But it was something really important that I kind of wanted to get out there.
Yeah, it's very cool. And you have a very diverse background, and I can see a lot of different interests as well. And it's interesting. I'm just curious because I myself was for a number of years quite interested in the military, and I'm still kind of on and off about whether or not I'd like to join. Were you an officer or were you a
No,
regular?
I was enlisted. I didn't realize there was 2 different kinds. But it was really good. I got a guarantee for aviation electronics. They tried to convince me I would be better on a submarine, and I was like, nope, we're not going on a submarine. Airplanes and computers. So I spent a number of years on shore duty, and then they sent me off on an aircraft carrier for 2 years. Did a tour in the Mediterranean, North Atlantic, and the Virgin Islands. I just loved it. It was so much fun. And it's an experience you cannot explain to someone who hasn't done it, and it's really hard to get your brain wrapped around. You're 5,000 men in an aircraft carrier, you're flying aircraft off the top of the thing in the middle of the ocean. It's just mind-boggling. It's you can't get that experience anywhere else.
And it's great. And I think that must be something that informs a lot of your writing, is that you've had a lot of different life experiences, and that adds a lot of color to the way that you write.
Yeah, I had a question about, speaking of wrapping your head around something. You mentioned that you're interested in programming and doing sort of like computer coding and things like that. So I'm interested in like thinking of how science and literature kind of combine. And you mentioned that you were really interested in the story structure aspect. So do you find similarities in coding and story structure? And does your background in tech like help at all in story writing?
It does. I used to belong to a group called Story Engineers. And we met at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, so only the service people would come. And we studied a book called Story Engineering, and it explains about the story structure and which pieces come where, and how you organize the elements of a book. And it's very, very engineering wise, and it reminds me a lot of how I write code, right? When I write an outline for a book, I come up with a theme, I come up with an idea, I nail down some major signposts and start sketching it in, and it's basically a modified snowflake that follows the story engineering structure. And when I code, it's the same way. You start with high-level objects, and you write them more and more detail, and eventually you're writing really low-level stuff. So I kind of write my books the same way.
That's so cool.
Yeah, interesting.
That's such an interesting way of going through it, because as a writer myself, I'm more of a gardener type of person, so I'll just kind of go off and see where the characters take me. But it sounds like you're more of the architect kind of.
Yeah, if I follow the characters, they lead me right down a dead end, and then I'm done. I was one book I was trying to write without an outline. 60,000 words into the book, one character turned to the other, and he goes, "Why do you care?" I was like, I have no idea. I could not figure it out. And I was like, that's it. I threw the book away. I said, can't figure out why the main character is doing what he's doing. Can't figure it out.
Right.
So I work without outline. I'm scared to try without. I always get stuck.
On the topic of interests and background as well, James, are you at all interested in history? Is that something that's quite appealing to you?
Not, I always said I hated history. I didn't like the names and dates and places. And I had a class, I needed one history class, right, to get my undergraduate, and it was all names and dates and places. And I took the guy's exam, and I wrote down all the names and dates and places I couldn't remember, and then wrote a 10-page essay on East Coast religion in America versus West Coast religion in America and sociological impact. It was like, since I don't know the names and the dates and places, I can't tell you why this stuff is important to learn. And the guy, he gave me a C anyway. I was like, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Well, you can talk about how technology and history kind of go together, and how technology develops over time. That's kind of an interesting thing to learn.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite books was, and I picked it up because it's entitled The Magical Engineer. And this is by Elie Modesset. And it was cool. The guy was a blacksmith, and he's making a steam engine, right? But he was a wizard, and he was imbuing with magic. And I really liked the story. It was the first book I read by him. And I read a couple more, and then a little while later, I picked up another one. It's called The Color of Chaos, and I started reading. And about a third of the way into it, I went, wait a minute. This is the wizard, the bad guy from the other book. And he's got two books, and one is the black guy is the good guy, and the white guy is the evil guy in the background. And the other book, the white guy is the good guy, and the black guy is the evil guy in the background. And it just blew me away. And I thought, there you go. The villain is the hero of his own story. And this guy actually wrote two books to show you, and you really believe that the hero is in the right, and it's the bad guy from the other book. And it really influenced a lot of what I do when I write bad guys now. They've got to have a fully fleshed out motivation.
So on newest release, Indentured Magic, the blurb on Amazon.com mentions that you were deeply saddened by tales of human trafficking. Makes perfect sense. Can you tell us a bit about those tales that you've encountered, and that just the ones, many that specifically may have motivated you to write this book? Or are there any in the book that kind of mirror something that you've heard in reality?
Well, you guys are going to get a scoop, because I actually haven't told anybody this, but I'm working on trying to figure out how to write it in. I was trying to come up with a good idea for a new book, and I was just struggling with big bad evil wizard wants to be the biggest, baddest evil wizard in the world. I mean, they've done it a million times. And I saw a presentation on human trafficking. They'd sent these young girls down to help out survivors, and they were explaining how you can get involved in this kind of thing. And I looked at it, and I was like, well, this is some far off place with people that don't look like us and they don't think like us. And, that's not really a thing we should worry about here. And something kept nagging at the back of my brain when I was thinking about that. And I thought, something's not sitting right with me about that whole concept. And then I realized that I actually know someone who is a survivor of human trafficking. And I met her through the writing circle. And she's a beautiful, charming young lady, and very strong. And after knowing her for a while, I found out that she had gone through this ordeal, and she writes about her struggles to recover. And I thought, this is someone I know. This is something that happened right here, right? So it's not something that's happening far off. And I started digging in, looking at more research, and it turns out it's very, very common. It happens a lot. And I looked at the research as to how it happens and how it goes on. And I thought, if I write the psychological profile of these survivors, And it's really more about the people and not what's happening to them, but how they deal with it. So there's no graphic violence. There's no graphic sex in the book. There's nothing, there's nothing you could let your kid read, but thematically it's very intense. And it's meant to portray how they survive, not how they're taken advantage of, but how they actually ultimately overcome in the end. So it was really very deep, and there's 5 different characters. We kind of get into each one, and the psychology of each one is different. Mm-hmm. So we kind of show you how different people handle the situation differently.
That's very interesting. I know that your main character, I believe, Medea, she's a female warrior.
Yes.
That's correct. So how did you kind of figure out that she would be the main character and writing in a female perspective and things like that? I'm not sure if you've done that before in your previous work, but
I have. It's one of those interesting things, and it's my opinion, but I've been told that I write women really, really well, and that's very difficult for a straight white old fart guy to write women very well. But I think there's a reason for that, and the reason is that when I write about men, I just assume they're like me. So I don't get into any detail, and I don't think about why they do what they do, because they just do what they do because they're guys, right? But women, we have no idea, right? I spent my entire life trying to figure out how my wife makes decisions and what she's going to come up with, right? And how women think and how they act. So I have this model built as to how they're supposed to work, right? And you're always fine-tuning it because you always get it wrong. And that's the model I use when I write the women, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about how they maybe work. I maybe get it right, maybe not. Medea, it's a fantasy world, so she was a sword mistress. It was kind of a given. That's really much of a cliche. And then after that, it worked into how she behaves and reacts. And then she starts out not a terribly likable character because she's very innocent and she's kind of full of herself. And then she realized that, maybe not. But she does learn and she grows and she becomes very, empowered and very successful and ends up taking, things on her own terms, which everybody who worked on the book except for me was a woman, and most of them were self-declared feminists. So I was very, very sure that I was getting it portrayed right. And one of my friends who did the final edit, she said, I just loved it. She said, you solved this problem in the way women do it, not the way guys do. She said, I thought for sure we're going to have a guy solution. You didn't. You used a woman solution at the end. It was really, really good. It's like, okay, fine. Got it right.
Yeah, there's a lot of attention these days to the way women are portrayed in fantasy literature, especially because there's a lot of tropes, and it's very cool to hear that you've received really great feedback about how you write women, obviously not being one. And it's something like Shalini, I'm kind of experimenting writing a fantasy story myself, and it's largely male-oriented, Kel's Surprise, but I'm kind of figuring out as well, like how I can write these characters that are female in a convincing way and not incorporate too many like cookie cutter type things. And I'm glad to hear you've had some great success doing that and
I've
writing.
been married a really long time, so I've had a lot of practice.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's kind of the main mode of research, if you can use that word, that I've been doing, is just reading how people who have written female characters successfully have done it, and I'm still very new to the whole thing, so it's just kind of a process.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of old white men who write women well. George R. R. Martin, of course.
To name specifically.
To name one. But he does portray a lot of graphic violence and sex, things like that, and
especially the show. Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
The show's a different piece.
Yes.
all together.
Yeah. The whole term sex position and things like that. So I was just curious as to what made you decide to kind of veer away from that and just portray the decisions and sort of the human aspect of those violent actions as opposed to.
I always love to get into these debates because you get into these with the writers and they're like, you should use bad language in your book. So, what if I don't want to? Well, you should. I don't have to, because my characters don't use it. And they go, everyone does. Like, no, maybe everyone in your world does, but not in mine. So it's part of my, I was a strict Midwestern upbringing. So I'm pretty, pretty conservative. And I don't want to write something that everybody can't read. So I want something that kids can read. I want something that people feel comfortable reading. And not everybody likes it, right? Somebody wrote me a horrible review and said this is like, written to put women in their place. It was a terrible book. Sorry you felt that way, because that's not the way it comes out. And if you'd have finished it, you would have got there. right? But it's got some really dark stuff in it. And yeah, I mean, human trafficking is a horrible thing, and it doesn't actually have a lot of respect for women, right? And I had to be able to portray not that side of it, but the survivor side of it, right? But I mean, definitely my rule is always keep it clean. There's no graphic sex, there's no graphic language, there's violence. I get knocked for once in a while, but I grew up on a farm. I killed animals, butchered them when we were kids, so that kind of thing doesn't really bother me. But I know it does bother some people. So
I think it's just in the end, if you're satisfied with what you have produced, then that's kind of what matters. And if you get good enough feedback from enough folks, then that's what kind of counts. And there's always going to be the outliers.
The goal here was to get you drawn into the plot and really experience the characters and really come to know them and feel for them, right? And then at the end of the book, you go, oh crap, right? This is real stuff, right? This is really happening to people. And get people to maybe wake up a little bit.
That's really important. So you mentioned on your website that you are a happy, active member of the writing community and you're part of several writing groups. When did you first start getting involved in writing groups? Did you do it from the very beginning when you first started? And what have you gained from it?
Let's see. I want to say 25 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Back before the World Wide Web was invented. I'm that old. Okay. I used to belong to a group called the Usenet News Group called Alt Writing. And under Alt Writing, we formed a critique group that meant via email. Right. So this is before we only had our own websites. And we would write a short story and mail it off to 6 other people. And they would critique it and then they would send it back. And then 2 weeks later, we get another prompt. We write for a week. And then we critiqued and we cycle. Every couple of weeks. Did that for about 3 years. And the first story I ever sent in was horrible. It was just awful. But I learned a lot, and I learned a lot working with those people and saw different styles and kind of got an understanding for styles. And then when my wife left me alone and I said, I got to get going, I joined a writers group in my hometown and got involved. And they're still good friends today. That's probably about 8 years ago. And we would meet every Tuesday, do critiques, and Saturdays we did the story engineers, and we do some spin-off classes here and there. And after a while, I realized that I was getting the same critique every week, so I started looking for another group. And I got involved with a second group and got different sets of critiques. And then when that one fell apart, I had another one. I got a hold of a friend, and I said, I'm looking for a professional group. And she actually invited me into a group of professional published writers. And a couple of them were New York Times best-selling authors, and one was a fantasy author. And she just absolutely ripped me to pieces. When she introduced me to the group, she says, don't be gentle with him. He's a pro because he's written multiple books and he needs to hear it from you guys. And because she writes in my genre, I have a lot of respect for her. And I take everything she says and try and work really hard to learn what that really means and then, apply it. So, and now I'm working with another group. It's very small. There's only 2 or 3 of us that meet, and we're kind of going through chapter by chapter, looking more at how does this play with the reader? And that to me is right. The ultimate test is what's the reader think, feel, and believe right now? And where are you leading them? Right. And it's not about the sentence structure or the paragraphing or the spelling. Editors will fix that kind of stuff. But how is the reader impacted by what you're writing? And that's kind of where we're focusing right now. Mm-hmm. So I love the groups, but you got to be careful.
Yeah.
You can get in a group where they give you this. I had one group, they kept saying there's way too much description, not enough emotion. Like, this is epic fantasy, not YA romance.
Yeah, I guess writers are like readers in that way, where it's just a flawed mix of people,
Yeah.
So.
Right.
In talking about why people read, especially for fantasy, we've kind of discussed sort of the purpose of fantasy ourselves. So it's an interesting genre because many people read it for its escapism, but a lot of fantasy actually talks about real world issues such as indentured magic with human trafficking. So what, in your opinion, is the role of fantasy for a modern day reader? And how do you achieve the right balance of escapism and reality in your own works? And is this something you think about?
It is something I think about, and it's something I put a lot of thought into when I was conceiving of this book, and thinking about a couple of next ones. Right, the next one's going to be easy. It fits well into my other world. It's not very deep, but beyond that, I've got some other things planned. Right, but I write fantasy because of the same way I read fantasy. I read it because I like to get engrossed into something that's not my normal world. I started reading fantasy because the books were really thick and they were really cheap, but I got hooked. Right, and I always say when you're writing fantasy, a lot of it is to give that depth of the world description, to draw the reader in, to make them feel like they're somewhere else. Right, but the story needs to do more than just be, people with swords whacking at each other or the wizards throwing fireballs and stuff. There's got to be some meaning behind it. And that was the dilemma I had when I sat down to write Indentured Magic. I was like, it has to be something that's not just a cookie cutter plot of bad versus evil. There's got to be more to it. And being able to show some social conscience in there, being able to portray something that's going to get people thinking about, this is an interesting concept, and it's something that applies to the real world. Right? I think I have actually 3 female characters. Got 2 published already. One is called The White Assassin, and that's a young white albino girl who's an assassin. She's the lead character in that book. Right? Indentured Magic is a female lead. I have another one I'm working on. There's a female sorceress. Right? And being able to portray women in a position of power in a fantasy world, to me, I think is a big deal. Right? They're not subservient. Yeah, I mean, the Middle Ages was crappy for everybody, but especially for women. Right? So we can portray them in a position of strength and show how they get there. Right? I'm going to be doing one on addiction. And that's going to be the thematic element of a big series I'm trying to put together. It sounds kind of ambitious. I keep looking at it going, that's a lot of work. But I like the idea, and I've got some really cool ideas on how to play it. So I want to put that in there, because that's another area that people, they kind of shy away from, is they don't want to have to think about those kinds of things, right? And I want people to sit back and go, that's a good point.
That's a really remarkable thing. We grow by confronting things that are uncomfortable, and it's just inevitable part of the process of becoming mentally stronger, but also more aware of things in yourself and in others and in society. And I noticed that too, especially when I was a little bit younger. I would avoid reading about certain things or books that had certain topics in them, because I just didn't want to confront what it was that was kind of bugging me. And then you go ahead and you read it, and then it kind of changes your mind about it a little bit, and you become a little bit more self-aware in that regard.
Right.
Yeah.
And fantasy is a good way to consume that as well, because you might not know what's actually in the story until you read it, and you're like, oh, I'm confronting this right now.
It would be different than, for example, if we were to read a book that is set in the real world in our current time, and it talks about human trafficking. It might be a little bit depressing to read. And so I think fantasy is a great vehicle to convey these kinds of things, and for people to kind of digest them in a familiar and kind of friendly manner. But Okay, so James, go ahead and give us a sense of where we can find out more about you and your work, where we can follow you and your social media pages, and about where we can get your latest book, Indentured Magic.
Okay, you can find Indentured Magic is on Amazon. Just search under Indentured Magic. You'll find me there. The name Eggebeen is impossible to spell out loud, but when you see it written down, it'll make a whole lot of sense. I'm on Facebook. I'm sometimes on Twitter, not all that much, but Facebook quite often. So that's it. But right now it's only out on Amazon. It's going to be coming out in paperback and hardcover pretty soon. I've got the hardcovers just about ready to go.
Well, Mr. James Eggebeen, thank you very much for coming on High Fantasy Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. You're a fascinating man. You have a very interesting past and present, and the things that you're working on seem quite incredible. We're very much looking forward to reading some of your works ourselves, and we hope that you keep on trucking.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much, and we'll perhaps talk to you again soon.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sure. We'll keep in touch.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well. Thanks.